It's interesting as I go through these chapters. Welcome back to another episode of Papa John's Scripture Notes Project. I'm looking at these chapters in Exodus after God stopped speaking directly to the people. They withdrew and they said, Moses, no, you go, you talk to him, tell us what he says, and whatever he says, we will do. And much of these chapters has ended up codified and included in the U.S. Code, statutes, and laws. And it's just interesting. In fact, I mentioned in the last episode the Supreme Court building in the United States. And if you look here at the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C., it's impressive. It's just amazing architecture. But if you zoom in, you'll see, in fact, let me just change my, I believe on one of the sides of the building it has Moses. And look at this. There's Moses as part of the architecture. And what are those tablets in his hands? So much of common law that we inherit from England as part of the laws that are all codified and enforced come from the Bible. That's what this is interesting. The founding fathers definitely wanted us to know the source of justice, and Lady Justice with her blind, her blindfolded eyes so that she could do justice without interpretation or being swayed by sympathies and such. It's just interesting that that's what we're studying right here. And I think this chapter is going to be interesting in that I'll skip through quite a bit of it, but there's one place where you're going to see how Christianity has changed the root word. How many times have you heard take care of the widows and the orphans in Christianity? And there's orphanages all over the world. Yet we're going to learn today in Exodus chapter 22 that that's just a little bit off and a little bit different. And that, again, Christianity with our surface level understanding kind of missed the point of the words God chooses and the exactness of those words and the point that he's trying to drive home. So we're going to find that out today with the help of Papa John and our Hebrew scholars and other Bible scholars, and with insights from myself. Again, what Papa John's trying to do is just provide information for my children and my children's children, soon to be, eventually, great grandchildren and such. My extended family today and friends that I know and enjoy life as we continue day by day through our faith journeys, even with our different backgrounds. We want to understand the Bible as close as we can get back to its original source. Exodus chapter 22, Jared Halverson, our LDS scholar, says chapter 22 has more laws, miscellaneous laws you might call them. Verse 1, if a man shall steal an ox or a sheep and kill it or sell it, he shall restore 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. So verse 1 is the punishment for theft. Verse 2, if a thief be found breaking up and be smitten that he die, there shall no blood be shed for him. So verse 2, Brother Halverson says, it's a law about death from self-defense. We will call this the castle doctrine. If somebody breaches my moat and comes into my castle, I am free to defend myself and my property. And then Jono Vandor, our Messianic believer from Australia, chimes in. He goes, my question about verse 1 is, why does he restore 5 oxen for an ox, but only 4 sheep for a sheep? And our Hebrew scholar Nehemiah Gordon says, well, So I would answer that with kaka, which is just because that's what the Torah says. That's a how often did I hear that growing up? Because I said so. Okay. And you know what? Wait till we get to Leviticus. You're going to see that a lot because I said so from God Himself. Quite interesting. As we kind of quickly go through this, Nehemiah Gordon adds, and the principle here in the Torah, which I think is a key principle, is that the Torah is presuming that in the dark you can't sort out this guy is harmful or not harmful. If there's any doubt, you have to defend yourself. So when it comes to breaking and entering or theft, you have the right to defend yourself and your property. Skipping through a lot of these, which I'm hoping if you ever wanted to, I'll have notes for almost every verse in the Bible to help us appreciate and get past just the surface level understanding. You'll notice in verse 11, I've highlighted the restored name of God the Father, Jehovah, right there. That's always a delight to see for Papa John and restore that when I can. And I use turquoise because that's kind of similar to the, the light blue, telet blue color, which they say is the color of the throne room of God in heaven. Now, verse 16 and 17, Jared Halverson says, verse 16 and 17 will expand beyond this for the restitution for theft or loss. If a man entices a maid that is not betrothed and lie with her, so we're moving from theft and restitution to adultery or fornication, and so if a man entices the maid, so she's not married, this would be, I guess, a virgin if I had to guess, and he lie with her. Now, Halverson says, now this is rape, or if not, it's simply fornication, which is wrong too. Well, what's the punishment? He shall surely endow her to be his wife. I guess this is where shotgun weddings come from, he adds. On the other hand, if her father utterly refused to give her unto him, so there's absolutely no way, no shotgun wedding here. I want to use my shotgun for something else. Well, he shall pay money according to the dowry of virgins. So, in some ways, here, if there is intimacy outside of wedlock, you need to take responsibility for it. In some cases, that means marriage. In other cases, that means having the baby and putting the baby up for adoption. In some ways, does that mean child support and alimony? Is treating people as they deserve to be treated, even when some wrongdoing has taken place. And that's definitely, I think, behind all of these uh, instructions from God. It's definitely He considers the the least of these, the least in society, are given some type of protection and recognition. Now, Nehemiah Gordon again, our Hebrew scholar, adds, so often when you have a string of commandments like this, and there are a few sections like this in the Torah, very often they're connected by a principle of association. But sometimes that principle is obvious to us, and sometimes it is not. In Deuteronomy 23:18, where it says, you must not bring the price of a prostitute, or the hire of a prostitute, or the price of a dog to the house of Jehovah your God for any vow. Wow, what in the world's going on there? Well, he continues to explain. What they used to do in the pagan world is they would go to the male or the female prostitutes and they would pay that money to the temple. Now, he's not talking about the Israelite temple, he's talking about pagan temples. And so he says they would pay that money to the temple, and that was their way of justifying prostitution. The Torah says, however, you must not do that. You must not bring the hire of a prostitute or the price of a dog. A dog in ancient Hebrew often referred to a male prostitute. Wow. Then in the very next verse it says, you must not lend to your brother on interest, the interest of money, or literally silver, or the interest of food, or the interest of any matter which you lend on interest which actually is related to our passage, which mentions not lending or on interest to the poor. So my question is, why and how in the world do you go from prostitution to now banking and how to borrow or lend money with interest? Well, he continues to explain. Nehemiah says, how is lending on an interest related to bringing the hire of a prostitute? Oh, this is what I just said. And the price of a dog. Well, the Hebrew word for interest is nashak, which means biting, literally biting interest. So this isn't talking about, well, this is arguable, but presumably this is not talking about if somebody is in the middle class, takes out a 30-year mortgage to pay for his house. What this is talking about is somebody who is desperately poor and needs money, and you get a credit card on them and charge them like 23% interest. That is exploitation. That's nechesh. That's biting interest. And so the connection here is entirely by the association of the word nechesh, biting interest, and the word kalev, literally a dog, but in the context, it's referring to a male prostitute. So, contents wise, they don't really have anything to do with each other. But if you were an Israelite, and that would be your way of remembering it, oh, we're talking about the dog, the male prostitute, and now we're talking about the biting interests because dogs bite. So, there is the principle of association as we read the scriptures at times. Now, again, my Christian friends and Latter day Saint friends, have you ever heard that anywhere else? I love studying the scriptures from a reliable Hebrew source, in addition to other Bible scholars. Now, verse 18 is interesting. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Okay, we're covering all the bases. But then the Joseph Smith translation says, Thou shalt not suffer a murderer to live. All right, Joseph Smith, perhaps. Again, I just like to have things to consider. And in time, we'll know if that's accurate or not. Jared Halverson says in verse 18 to 20, which we just read, verse 18, the Lord speaks of witchcraft and forbids it. And then he points out what I just did in the Joseph Smith translation. It actually changes it to murder. So that's an interesting switch. It also forbids bestiality and idolatry. This is kind of a quick succession through three major sins. And that's why Papa John's just going to keep going here. Now back to Jared Halverson as he talks about verses 20 and 21. Thou shalt neither vex a stranger nor oppress him. And here's why. For ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. Okay, so that's actually a healthy reminder. You were once a stranger. In fact, you were once more than a foreigner. You were a slave in Egypt. So thou shalt neither vex a stranger nor oppress him. Stranger in the context of a foreigner, someone from a different country. So Brother Halverson adds, this is an interesting twist on the golden rule. It's not just treat them as you would want to be treated, but treat them as you wished that you had been treated when you were going through similar things. This is compassion and suffering born out of shared suffering. I know exactly how that feels, and I will treat you kindly as a result. More compassionately and with empathy, empathetically. Pure enforced empathy. So if this is now a law, it's kind of enforced by law to be more compassionate. This is now he goes, this next one is one of the more brutal passages of enforced empathy, one of the most enforced empathetic scriptures you'll see in scripture. So buckle up for this one. And Papa John's inserted a picture here. And what do you see? What are we looking at here? A woman with three small children. Okay, let's just continue. Verse 22, this is very short. Ye shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. And look at all the companion verses, the CVs that Papa John has attached to this verse. I have a soft place in my heart. And I'm also appreciative of this verse because for many years, one of my assignments in the LDS church, and there's no paid clergy with the LDS Church. It's a lay ministry, and so you're asked to serve, and you say yes or no. It's up to you, but you're not paid for these positions. For many years, I was assigned for the single adults that were over like 35 years old, single men and women. Some had children, some did not, and we would do our best to have activities and fellowship. And within that group, there was a lot of widows, or some widows. And even if they weren't widows, there was quite a few divorcees with a lot of responsibility when it comes to children and raising them on their own. Well, what does God say here? Ye shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. And when it comes to ministering assignments, another part of the LDS culture, this is good for those of the other faiths that are curious about why we do what we do. There's a program called, for many years, home teaching, but they tried to find a word uh, more biblical. And so it's now called ministering instead of home teaching. And so when I'm asked to be a ministering brother, it's when I and another brother are assigned certain families, and every family should have a ministering brother and sister, uh, where the sisters look out for the sisters, the brothers look out for the men, in the sense that, hey, just check on each other monthly, make sure everyone's doing okay. And that's called ministering. And if I'm ever assigned a single mother to check on, or my wife, we now take that extra seriously because of this verse and the follow-up verses. And so I hope that if you're ever given that assignment, or if you come across those in need that are widows or fatherless, that we'll take this seriously. Now, orphanages, that's a huge thing in Christianity. And we talk about the widow and the orphans. But the point I'm trying to make, Papa John's focused on this word fatherless. And it seems that the Lord is focused on this word fatherless and attached to the widow. And so to call them orphans, I'm going to demonstrate how that just takes away and distracts us from God's point, and why Brother Halverson says this is one of the most brutal passages of Scripture for enforced empathy that you'll find. All right, here we go. Now, Brother Halverson says, like verse 21 says, don't vex a stranger. You know what that's like, remembering that you were once a stranger in Egypt. Then verse 22, in case you've forgotten, you shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. Maybe you haven't been one of those, unlike having been a stranger and even a slave. And then he continues in 23 and 24. But before we go there, Nehemiah Gordon, our Hebrew scholar, adds something that I want to include. That's actually a key principle in the Torah, which we call in Hebrew midah kenecha, keneked uh, midah, which literally means measure for measure. And I can almost see that when you stare at it in Hebrew. Measure for midah, keneked midah. Measure for measure. It's the principle of reciprocal justice, that God will punish you in a way that you have sinned, or in a way that's connected to the way you have sinned. And here you've oppressed the poor, the widows and the orphans. He uses the Christian term, those who don't have someone to look out for them. Your children will end up being like that as well. That's reciprocal gesture. What's he talking about? Well, the next verse, or the next two verses. If thou afflict them in any wise, and they cry at all unto me, I will surely hear their cry. And you know what? Papa John believes that some of the first prayers God ever responds to or hears, that trump all other prayers, is the cry for help from a mother, as a widow or otherwise. I just know in my heart that my mother's prayers were heard before mine or even my father's. God holds a special place in his heart, and that's going to be shown as we get through this teaching. All right, here we go. Hang on, fasten your seatbelts. Verse 24. So he's heard their prayers, the widow and the fatherless, and he says, so if we cause them, if we afflict them in any way, and they cry out unto God, I will surely hear their cry. Verse 24, and my wrath shall wax hot, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall be widows, and your children fatherless. Do you see why God doesn't use the word orphan? Okay, yes, your children will be orphans, but the point is they'll be fatherless. This is a very, very direct scripture, I believe, directed towards the priesthood, towards the men. And if we don't take seriously, wow. I think if that doesn't put fire under your britches to get off the couch and monthly check on them at the very least, I don't know what else would do it, because this is the the God of the universe talking. And he's talking to Israel, which in Christianity we claim to be adopted into. Okay. So Jared Halverson says, how's that for enforced empathy? Would you prefer compassion chosen, or compassion compelled? That is intense, and I agree. And then he wraps up this footnote by saying, understand what he's saying here. God is so serious about caring for the poor, the marginalized, and the vulnerable, the least of these, my brethren, than what we've done, then we've done it unto him. Now he's referring to Matthew 25:40. So we better be careful, and that's the point. In fact, if I turn to Matthew in my Papa John notes, building up to verse 40, this is in the book of Matthew, chapter 25. For I was a hungered, and you gave me meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. Naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came unto me. Then shall the righteous answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we thee a hungered and fed thee, or thirsty and gave thee drink? When saw we thee a stranger and took thee in, or naked and clothed thee? Or when saw we thee sick or in prison and came unto thee? And the king shall answer and say unto thee, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me. And I believe when he says my brethren, he's talking about humanity, which would include obviously widows and children. The least of these, well, widows and children would qualify as the least of these. Powerful stuff here, beautiful to be reminded of. Verse 25, we continue, if thou lend money to any of my people that is poor by thee, thou shalt not be to him as a usurer, neither shalt thou lay up unto him usury. If thou at all take thy neighbor's raiment to pledge, thou shalt deliver it unto him by that the sun goeth down, for that is his covering only, perhaps his only covering, right? It is his raiment for his skin, wherein shall he sleep? And it shall come to pass when he crieth unto me, because it's cold at night, right? That I will hear, for I am gracious. Jared Halverson adds, he's still worried about the poor and the needy. He forbids usury. That's charging interest, because debt will only further impoverish the poor. If you loan the money and you're trying to help them, or are you trying to hurt them? So be careful with that. If their collateral is if all they have is a coat, well then let them keep it in times of need. Now Nehemiah Gordon will improve on that as our Hebrew scholar. He says, so this is one of the most interesting passages in the Torah, and that's because archaeologists actually uncovered this inscription, and it's on display at the Israel Museum. They uncovered it on the coast of Israel at a place called Mesad HaShaveho. It's actually a letter written, scribbled onto a piece of pottery by a field worker. The field worker is writing to the judge, to the magistrate, and he's saying how he owed somebody money, and the guy showed up and took his garment, and he says, please return my garment. I have nothing else. I don't have anything to sleep with. What's so interesting, Nehemiah says, is you can tell by the way he writes that he's obviously, these are letters that he's written, but it's not written by a king or their scribe, which have a very formal style. He's not a trained as a writer. He's not trained as somebody who speaks and writes at a high level of Hebrew. He's writing from his heart. And what's interesting is that he's literate. That's actually amazing, right? He can actually write, but he doesn't even have a piece of parchment. All he has is a scrap of pottery that he's writing his letter on. And he's actually somebody who's living a living example of this passage, whose garment was taken away because he owed money. And he's saying, please just return it to me. I have nothing else. I didn't do anything wrong. I need my garment back. It's true. I owe money. I owe money to this guy, but I can't pay it right now. And luckily, he didn't have any parchment or paper because he scratched it into some pottery. It's a part of pottery that, preserved that his plea to the magistrate. That's pretty cool. Kind of amazing. Now, who are we looking at here? This is the man that taught me and his wife. They taught me about this scripture and the focus on the fatherless. And amazing man. I, I, I'm not prepared to go into it in a lot of detail, but Yehuda Glick is his name, and his wife Hadass. The only other Hadass I know is Hadassah, who we know as Esther in the Old Testament. We'll get to her book eventually soon. Well, Yehuda Glick is an activist, a temple activist, trying to get the rights for the Hebrews and the Jewish people to be able to pray on the Temple Mount. And there's often that's prohibited in Israel because the Muslims control the Temple Mount. And he's an activist of sorts. And what's amazing about Yehuda is he survived an assassination attempt, point blank. I believe 4 shots in the chest right after he'd finished speaking, and he survived. And his assassin was shot and killed when they tried to arrest him later at his home. Um, Remarkable. That's a God story, right? Well, he was also a member of the Knesset for a short time, which is similar to their Congress in the Israeli government. And while he was on the Knesset in his role in the government, his soon-to-be wife Hadass approached him. She's a widow, and she explained to him how the government is neglecting the widows and not following the Torah. And he's acting like, well, no. And he kind of defended the government, and she said no. And he goes, I've talked to the religious leaders, to the rabbis and such, and they have programs. He goes, I'm telling you. And so they actually ended up getting married, which I think is a beautiful part of the story. And he was a widower himself, and so that's why she approached him, knowing that his wife had passed away. And now that they're married, even before the war that began October 7th a few years ago, they had begun reaching out to the leaders of the community and trying to identify the widows and their children. So when the war hit, they had already started a ministry of sorts. And think of when they were all huddled in their houses for months and months and months as the mother of small children. And they were meeting now with them. They had organized enough to provide board games and other ways to get the kids to stop watching the news and the mothers from stop watching the news to improve instead of just hunkering down in such a terrible environment. And so they're very passionate. And they made it clear to Papa John, and I took it to heart, that if I'm ever exposed to the needs of a divorcee or a widow who has children, especially, that I'll be held responsible if I do not act, if I ignore and neglect. So I share that with you in the spirit of love. And I'm thankful for Yehuda Glick and his wife Hadass and their ministry and for all they try to do. Um, Quite interesting. Okay, and we continue, verse 28. Nehemiah Gordon, thou shalt not revile the Elohims, the lowercase g's or gods, nor curse the rulers of thy people. So Nehemiah says, in the ancient world, they, as a rule, didn't really choose their leaders. They were often imposed upon them, and it's saying not to curse their leaders. So I think a leader that you, through your system of democracy, have put into place over you, I think you certainly shouldn't be cursing that person. In fact, he says, I would say, yes, unless you live in an oppressive society where your life is put in danger by your leaders, if you just happen to have bad leaders, well, you actually have a system in place to get them out of office. But you certainly shouldn't be cursing them either way. You should have respect for their leaders, for your leaders and their position. Okay, good reminder. Isn't that the value of the scriptures? Just to help us remember these things. With social media, and there's so much negative out there, boy, we could benefit from people spending some time in these chapters here that are often overlooked. Um, and we're just going to end with one more note. Jared Halverson, at the end of this chapter, ye shall be holy men unto me. That's what I'm after. Wouldn't you agree? That's what God's asking for. To be ready to come up to the mount, to be worthy of it, to be holy just as I am holy. A holy nation is what I intended for you to become when I first called you my peculiar treasure. Okay, a shorter episode of Papa John Notes, but that's always a good thing. Consider these things, think about them. Boy, when I say be mindful of those around you, I hope in the context of widows and the fatherless, I hope that we have eyes that are a little more, well, we see the opportunity and we also see the warning from God, especially if they fall within our purview and our responsibilities within our different congregations and churches and such. All right. Well, again, study the scriptures as you can, in addition to what we're sharing here. And I look forward to the next episode, which is going to really drive home the point of how the Father and the future Son of God, how their names in Hebrew interplay and point towards each other. It's quite remarkable to find it right here in the Old Testament. And I look forward to doing the next episode with you, and I'll talk to you again really soon.